Virgo, let me start with the pushing away before the longing, before the wishing to be closer, before everything that is happening now in the interior of the person who pushed and is now feeling the consequence of the pushing, in the specific and uncomfortable form of wanting what they pushed further from themselves than it currently is. I want to start with the pushing away because I think the pushing deserves an explanation that is more honest and more specific than the explanations that are usually offered for why someone pushes away. The person they actually want closer, in the particular and counterintuitive dynamic that produces the specific situation that this reading is about, because the pushing away of something you want is not a simple thing. And explaining it simply in the too afraid or not ready form, that is the usual shorthand for this particular dynamic, does not give you the full understanding of what was actually happening. In the person who pushed, when they were pushing before the longing replaced the pushing as the dominant experience of their interior life. In relation to you, welcome, and let me give you the full understanding. When someone pushes away what they want, they are not pushing away the wanting. The wanting is still there in full force and often in increasing force as the pushing happens, because pushing something away does not reduce the wanting of it. It amplifies the wanting in the specific and frustrating way of someone who is actively creating the distance between themselves and what they want, and feeling the distance they are creating as the pain of the separation from the thing they are actively separating themselves from. By the pushing that is doing the separating, what they are pushing away is not the wanting, but the fear of the wanting in the specific and particular form of someone who is afraid, not of you specifically, but of what allowing themselves to fully want you would require of them in the interior dimension of someone who has to become someone who can fully want something without the protective distance that the pushing was maintaining. The pushing away is self-protection in the specific and costly form of someone who is protecting themselves from the vulnerability of fully wanting something that they are not sure they can have, or that they are not sure they deserve, or that they are not sure they can sustain in the form that fully wanting it would produce if the wanting were allowed to be fully expressed rather than pushed away into the protective distance of someone who is managing the wanting rather than inhabiting it. The protection is real, and it served the person doing the pushing in the specific form of keeping them from having to be fully present in the wanting of something that they feared the wanting of for reasons that were entirely their own, and that had nothing to do with who you are or what you were offering or whether you were worth the wanting in the full and unprotected form. That the fear was protecting against, the pushing away was not about you. I want to say that clearly. And directly, before we move to the longing, because the longing makes more sense, when the pushing is fully understood as the self-protective mechanism it was, rather than the rejection it appeared to be from the outside of the person doing the pushing, which is where you were when the pushing was happening, and where the pushing produced its particular pain in the form of the apparent rejection that it was not, even when it looked like one. I want to describe the specific form of fear that the pushing was protecting against, because fear is a large category, and the specific form of fear that produces the pushing of something wanted is different from the ordinary fears that most people are familiar with in the direct and named form of knowing what they are afraid of and being able to say it when asked. The fear that produces the pushing of something wanted is the fear of being known in the specific and complete form of someone who is afraid that if you see all of them in the full and unmanaged form, that the proximity of someone genuinely wanted makes available to the person being wanted, you will find something that makes the wanting stop. In the person who was wanted, the fear is not that you will reject them. Exactly. It is the fear that you will see them fully, and the seeing will produce in you what the pushing was trying to prevent. By maintaining the distance, that prevents the full seeing and therefore protects the possibility of the wanting continuing on your side in the incomplete and therefore sustainable form of someone who has not yet seen everything and who still has the full wanting, that the pushing was protecting at the cost of the proximity, that the wanting deserved, and that the fear was preventing through the pushing that maintained the distance, which is what they are experiencing right now. In the active and present tense of something they cannot stop feeling, in the specific and particular form of the wanting that the pushing did not reduce, but amplified, in the particular way that pushing something away always amplifies the wanting of it by making the distance visible in the painful form of what is missing from the space it occupied before the pushing made the space available by removing what was in it, which was you, in whatever form of presence you had, before the pushing produced the distance that is now producing the longing. The longing is the specific form of wanting that exists when the thing being wanted is at a distance from the person wanting it, that the person wanting it created, which is a particular and uncomfortable form of longing, because it carries, in addition to the ordinary difficulty of wanting something that is not currently available, the specific additional difficulty of having been the one who made it unavailable through the pushing that produced the distance, that is now the source of the longing. They are longing for something that is not currently available to them because they made it unavailable, which is a specific and compounding form of pain. That the ordinary longing of wanting something you do not have does not fully capture, without the additional weight of the responsibility for the unavailability that the person who pushed carries now in the longing that followed the pushing as its natural and proportionate result. Whew. I want to describe what the longing looks like in the specific and interior form of what they are experiencing right now. As they are wishing to be closer, in whatever specific form the wishing takes, in their particular interior and their particular way of experiencing the wanting that the pushing amplified rather than reduced, the longing arrives in the ordinary moments of the ordinary day, not in the dramatic form of a single overwhelming wave that arrives and consumes and then recedes, as waves do, into the ordinary texture of things after the peak of the wave has passed. The longing arrives in the pauses between things, when the occupation that keeps the longing from the surface of the attention briefly suspends, and what is beneath the surface has the momentary access to the surface that the suspension creates before the next occupation fills the pause and returns the longing to its beneath the surface position until the next pause creates the next access in the repeated and daily form of a longing that is always there and that surfaces whenever the occupation is briefly suspended by the ordinary pauses of an ordinary day. In those pauses, they think of you, not deliberately, not in the intentional form of someone who has decided to think about you and is directing their attention toward the thinking, but in the involuntary form of someone who finds, in the moments when the occupation is suspended, that the thing their attention returns to without having been directed there is you. You return to their attention, uninvited, in the particular way that things we want and have pushed away return to the attention of the person who pushed them away, because the wanting did not go with the pushing, and the wanting is still there, looking for its object in the quiet moments when the occupation cannot hold it away from the surface any longer. I want to speak now about what the wishing to be closer looks like in the specific and practical form of what it is producing in them. In terms of actual thought and actual consideration, rather than only the feeling of the longing, which I have already described, in the interior and emotional form that it takes in the pauses between things. The wishing to be closer is producing thoughts about how, in the specific and practical form of someone who is thinking about what they would need to do or say or change in themselves to close the distance that the pushing produced in the form that would actually close it, rather than in the form that would only appear to close it, while the things that produced the pushing in the first place were still present and unaddressed. They are thinking about the closing in the full and honest form of someone who has understood something about what the pushing produced and what the longing is telling them about what the pushing cost and what the closing would require of them specifically, rather than of the circumstances or of you or of anything external to them that could make the closing easier without the interior work that the closing actually requires of the person who created the distance. They are now wishing to close. Now I want to speak to you specifically about what to do with the knowing that this reading has just given you about what is happening in the interior of the person who pushed and is now longing and wishing to be closer. The first thing, receive the explanation of the pushing as the self-protective mechanism it was, rather than as the rejection it appeared to be, not in the form of excusing what the pushing produced in you, which was real and painful and proportionate to the apparent rejection that the pushing looks like from your position outside the person doing it, but in the form of understanding it completely, so that the understanding can replace the incomplete version of a rejection that was actually fear, wearing the costume of distance, rather than the actual and deliberate choice to remove you from the wanting that the fear was actually protecting from the vulnerability of full expression. The second thing, do not move toward the longing before it moves toward you in the form of the closing that I described as the wishing to be closer, producing actual thought about how and what would need to change and what the interior work requires. The longing is real and it is moving in your direction, but it has not yet completed its movement into the form of actual action toward closing the distance that the pushing produced and moving toward the longing before it has completed its movement toward you interrupts the process of the longing becoming the closing by inserting your movement into the space where their movement needs to happen for the closing to be genuine, rather than only the appearance of closing that would result from your movement toward the longing before the longing has produced its own movement toward you in the form that makes the closing real. Wait and let the longing complete its movement before you close any part of the distance that the pushing produced. I want to say something about what waiting means here in the specific and honest form of what the waiting requires of you. Because waiting, when you know that someone is longing for you and wishing to be closer, is one of the more demanding things that this kind of situation asks of the person on the receiving end of the pushing that produced the distance and the longing that is now crossing it in the direction of you. The waiting does not mean passivity or the absence of your own engagement with your own life, while the longing completes its movement into the form of the closing that will eventually arrive in whatever specific form your life delivers it. The waiting means continuing to be fully in your own life, in the complete and self-directed form of someone who has not suspended their living, in anticipation of the longing arriving in a form that requires their response, but who is simply in their life as it is right now, while what is moving toward them completes its movement at whatever pace the movement takes in the interior of the person making it. The waiting is actually the easiest available option for someone who is fully in their own life rather than the hardest one, because the fully in their own life position is the position from which the waiting does not feel like waiting, but like living while something approaches that they are not required to go toward, because it is already coming. Without the going toward, be in your life while the longing completes its movement toward you, and the waiting will take care of itself in the specific form of not needing to be waited by someone who is living rather than waiting. Receive the closing when it comes from the full and aware position of someone who understands what produced it and what the longing contained and what the interior work required of the person who pushed and then longed and then worked and is now closing the distance they created in the full and genuine form of someone who has done what the closing required of them rather than only of the circumstances. Receiving from the full and aware position is receiving as someone who knows the whole story, including the part that was invisible while the pushing was happening, and that this reading has just made visible in the full and specific form of why the pushing happened and what it was protecting and what the longing that followed it is saying about what was always there beneath the pushing, in the form of the wanting that the pushing was trying to protect from its own full expression, and that is now available in the wishing to be closer that is moving toward you right now from the interior of the person who pushed and longed and is now finding the way back to the proximity they should never have left. They pushed you away, and the pushing produced the longing. That is producing the wishing to be closer. That is producing the movement that is coming toward you right now, in the form that the full circle of the pushing and the longing always eventually produces in the person who pushes what they want and then feels the consequence of the pushing, in the specific and amplified form of the longing that returns them to the direction of what they pushed, which is you. I want to say one last thing about what this full circle means, not just for them, but for you as the person who was pushed and who is now being longed for, and who is about to receive the closing of the distance that the pushing created. What the full circle means for you is a specific and earned quality of knowledge that you would not have if the pushing had not happened in the form it happened, at the time it happened, without the particular pain of the apparent rejection that the pushing produced in the person on the outside of it, which was you. The knowledge is this: you were wanted throughout, even during the pushing, even in the distance, even in the silence that the pushing produced between you when the distance was at its largest and the wanting felt least present from the outside of the person who was doing the wanting and the pushing simultaneously, in the particular and costly form of someone who was managing the wanting rather than inhabiting it, at the full cost of the managing, which was the distance that the longing is now crossing. You were wanted throughout, and you are wanted now in the wishing to be closer that this reading has just made visible to you in the full and specific form of what has been happening on the other side of the distance that the pushing created and that the longing is crossing in your direction right now, from the full and knowing position of someone who now understands everything that happened on both sides of the distance, that the pushing created, and that the longing is now crossing in the direction of you, in the wishing that is already in motion, and that is about to arrive in whatever specific and real form your specific life delivers it in.